Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have another incredible and insightful episode for you guys today, so hopefully you enjoy. And, of course, we've got a big topic from last week that was a little bit contentious with some of the views I was expressing on Twitter about it, and I'm, of course, talking about the House Speaker battle. At the end of the day, Kevin McCarthy pulled it out after 14 ballots, and he was elected to be House Speaker, against much opposition from the conservative right wing of the House, and particularly from a lot of House Freedom Caucus members, and from Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, and a few others. I think it was 20 holdouts in total who were voting against McCarthy in previous ballots, but they eventually turned and voted for him or voted present. So we now have House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. After much delay and opposition and work, we are now stuck with Kevin McCarthy as House Speaker for the time being. So when the opposition first emerged at the first ballot on last Tuesday, I was a bit skeptical of the effort because I was worried that all that it would turn out, they would have this hard opposition to McCarthy, never Kevin, as they were talking about, and they just end up with a slightly worse House Speaker despite all the effort, and they blow all their political capital on that. But I was wrong that this actually turned out to be much better than expected. I think the original plan was to just get anyone not named Kevin McCarthy, which would have been Steve Scalise. And Steve Scalise is virtually the same as Kevin McCarthy, but I think he is less amenable to the House conservatives, and he's less pro-Trump than McCarthy. So he would in some ways be worse than McCarthy. I think that a lot of this is a personality conflict. A lot of people don't like Kevin McCarthy. I hear he's an asshole, so I agree with that. And much of this was driven by personal animus rather than ideological problems for this, even though outside of it, they were like, this is a revolt against the establishment. This is a revolt against the way Washington works. This is the people speaking. In some ways, that was the case. But for the congressmen, it was mainly that they didn't like Kevin McCarthy and that they wanted more power for their side, which is understandable. Most of the congressmen who were opposing McCarthy were the best congressmen in the House. I mean, Gaetz, Rosendale, some of the others that were involved, a lot of these guys, Gosar obviously, a lot of these are the best congressmen that are there. And so you have to listen to what you should listen to what they have to say and about McCarthy. And some of these, I mean, Gaetz did show a lot of skill in this. I think one of the positive things that came out of this is that Gaetz really emerged to show himself off as a very talented politician. He was on TV every day, really doing a good job for arguing for his side. He was the leader of the opposition. There's multiple leaders. There was the one who was a more moderate faction, which was led by Chip Roy and Scott Perry, who were wanting their particular demands met and particular concessions met. And they were the first, and the people that they were leading were the first to go and vote McCarthy, while Gaetz was the real leader of the hardcore never Kevin side, and he wasn't responsible for probably this vote turning out the way it did, because I don't think the more moderates who joined, and this is relative moderates, the moderates really hated them, and speaking in the House Republican caucus, but the moderates on the never Kevin position, I think joined in when they realized that Gaetz had mustered up 5 votes to deny Kevin McCarthy the speakership on the first ballot. So they're just like, let's join up and see where it goes, and maybe we can wring concessions out of him. And they did. As I said, my main worry about this was that they would just go, they would waste all this effort, and then they would just pick anyone not named Kevin McCarthy. And this guy didn't even need to be good on the issues, or he didn't even need to make necessary concessions. They just wanted someone not named Kevin McCarthy. I didn't think this was realistic, but there was a chance that possibly they would pick a moderate Republican or a moderate Democrat to be out there, and the moderate Republicans would vote for that guy along with Democrats, and that person would be House Speaker, and it would have been a very terrible situation. But fortunately, that's not what happened. And so I think at the end of the day, you got the best possible result from the speakership. McCarthy gave some serious concessions. He is going to back a full church-style committee, which they refer to the church committee as this I was about to say investigatory committee the Senate did against the CIA and the intelligence agencies in 1970, headed by Frank Church. I forget if he was Idaho senator or one of those states. I believe it was Idaho, who led this. He was a Democrat. And it was a big deal at the time. The 70s really exposed a lot of the misdeeds of the intelligence community. And it was a big deal and shaped American public opinion. And now they want to do a new church-style committee to go after how the FBI, CIA, and others have been weaponizing information, have been going after Republicans and conservative, and been involved in the political process. So that should be really good. That's one thing that he has promised full support for. They changed the rules to now allow it just in past to say a no confidence vote in the House Speaker required 5 votes. Now it just requires 1 vote. That gives them more power to, if a speaker isn't doing a good job, but they can, vote a no confidence and get a new speaker. A lot of the committee assignments have now been assigned to, or and particularly the powerful committees are now being doled out to a lot of the House Freedom Caucus guys. So that's very positive. They're going to have votes on a lot of different issues. They have one on a border bill. They have another on voting on term limits, which I will say we'll go onto the term limits thing in a minute, and also a vote on debt ceiling, or promising that there will be no raise to the debt ceiling. They're going to have a vote to end all COVID mandates and all the remnants of all those policies. A lot of it, other things are insider baseball, like about how long a bill is read before it's voted on or discussed. As I said, the committee assignments, some of the bills of how a bill is passed, it gives a lot more power to people who would be called backbenchers to have a sway over it and have influence over it. So a lot of that is deals that I think the average American, the average layman probably wouldn't understand. It would be like, why is this a big deal? These changes do help out the House conservatives and that side, the right-wing faction in the House, but outside of that, some of it is insider baseball. The one thing that I'm not sure if it's still a part, but I knew they were demanding it, and this was tentatively agreed to by Kevin McCarthy, and this is a big deal, is that McCarthy's PAC will not be involved in open House primary seats. This is very good if he actually sticks by it, because open primary seats, it's very easy for the establishment to pick a candidate and say, this is our guy, this is who we're running against, and that person can defeat right-wing challengers. Without that money, it would be much easier, or the right-wing challenger would have a much better chance against an establishment candidate in those races. So that would allow the Republican Party to develop in a more America First nationalistic direction, more Trumpian direction, without the establishment putting their finger on the scale in those races. So that would be very good. So to conclude, yes, I think actually the fight was worth it. I think both sides didn't really have a plan going. They were just kind of figuring this out. Is that, these Never Kevin types were, they really didn't like him. They just wanted to make a stand. They got a lot of attention and a lot of support from conservatives and conservative media. And they're just, we'll figure this out as we go along. And then McCarthy is like, we'll figure out a plan for how to get these guys on board going forward. I think this was a fault that all this could have been done before the first ballot last Tuesday, is that they could have agreed to this. I would say that that's more Kevin McCarthy's fault, is that McCarthy may have put them off for a long time before. He realized that they had the majority 2 months before. He had 2 months to figure out how to get everybody on, get the necessary amount of votes. He could have made these concessions long before. Maybe it's that these guys weren't, being forceful enough and saying, hey, we're not going to vote for you. I do think for a lot of the moderate guys like Chip Roy and Scott Perry and some of those types, for the majority of them, of the people who are voting, they probably was a game time decision to go along with this, because they realized, okay, there was always a debate over how many votes McCarthy had. It was like saying seems to be 3 hard no's, maybe 4, maybe 5. And I think on Tuesday or the day before, they realized there's at least 5 or more. So let's jump on board and see what we can do. And it was a successful bit of politicking, but it does show that McCarthy is going to be a very weak House Speaker, and that McCarthy should have figured this out before the first ballot was cast. So that says something about McCarthy. You're definitely going to, this isn't the last time we're going to go through something like this, especially with the rule changes. They're voting on the rule changes tonight. It's still up in the air whether every Republican is going to vote for it or they're going to have the necessary Republican votes for it. So we'll have to see what that happens, but some of this stuff is probably going to go forward. So that's it for talking about the nitty gritty of it and whether it was useful or not. I think it was a worthwhile battle that could have happened. But now going to what are the deeper meanings of this battle and what does it say about the current political situation? That's a little bit more interesting way of looking at this. And the first thing I want to say is how Trump really, this seemed to, they always talk about these civil wars within the GOP and these battles within the party. And this is the first time that Trump did not play a major role. You could almost say that he didn't play much of a role at all, even though they all complimented on Trump and saying that the reason why a deal was made was due to Trump. And many of these members were complimenting on that. Even Kevin McCarthy said that. Marjorie Taylor Greene said that. So he did play a role, but it was not that great of a role, especially compared to fights in the past. He was not at the center of this fight. And even, he spent several days trying to talk and pressure these guys to vote for McCarthy, and they refused to him. And I think an indicative moment was, it was one of those great moments captured on camera from the last night of voting, where there was one where Representative Mike Rogers of Alabama tried to fight or tried to lunge at Matt Gaetz, and he had to be pulled away. There was another image of Marjorie Taylor Greene having her phone up, and Trump is on the line, and she's trying to show the phone to Matt Rosendale, and Rosendale is waving her off and saying, I'm not talking to Trump. I'm still going to vote against McCarthy. And that is like a very illustrative moment of that these people who were the hardcore opposition were saying, we understand what Trump is doing, but we don't really care. We're going to go with our own objectives in mind. So they are a MAGA wing that is breaking away from Trump, even though Matt Gaetz was also crediting Trump for this. But Matt Gaetz was also criticizing Trump during this battle, saying that saying that Trump's pick of McCarthy illustrates how he isn't great with personnel, with picking personnel management. And he was making light of that, even though after the fact, he's like, we credit Trump for negotiating this deal. We're both pro-Trump. Throughout the fight, he was in some ways, or not in some ways, he was moving away from Trump. And most of the types who were involved in this were not so much doing this or opposing McCarthy for MAGA reasons. They're opposing him more for Tea Party reasons. A lot of this fight was something you could have witnessed in the pre-Trump era. A lot of Republicans opposed John Boehner and tried to have votes against Boehner, but people feared Boehner a lot more. I think at that time, these candidates were much more worried about Boehner and the Republican establishment withdrawing funds for them when they try to run for re-election based on these speaker votes. For whatever reason, they don't worry about this now. Even Boebert, who was like one of the most hardcore anti-McCarthy types, won her election simply due to McCarthy funding her campaign. She won by a very thin margin, under 1,000 votes, I think it was the final recount total. And she could credit her victory to McCarthy, but she felt that she could do this or oppose McCarthy without consequence. And a part of the deal was that McCarthy would not retaliate against those who voted against him. And Boehner did retaliate against people who opposed him. In 2013, there was a number of Republicans who opposed him. I interned for one, actually, in that summer of 2013, and he made sure that they got committee assignments and even threatened to withdraw funding for their re-election campaigns due to voting against him. And in 2015, there was a fight over Kevin McCarthy becoming House Speaker because Boehner retired, and he, McCarthy was next in line, but there was this House Freedom Caucus rose up in arms against the idea of McCarthy, and McCarthy withdrew his name. And instead we got Paul Ryan, which was like which is why I was worried that we'd have a repeat of this time, is that they'd be so opposed to McCarthy that they'd end up with someone worse, like Paul Ryan as the House Speaker. Thankfully, we did not have that moment, and we had a much better result this time than in 2015. But all those opposition against McCarthy was like, they're not focused on government spending. They're not focused on the debt ceiling. We can't trust these guys to do what we want. And the same arguments were made against John Boehner. It's like he's not doing anything against big government, and we're so mad about this. And a lot of the arguments against McCarthy this time in 2023 were the same arguments that they were using this time. And even some of the votes that are coming up is that they're very insistent on this debt ceiling, that they will not expand the debt ceiling, is that this is a very much of a Tea Party concern. The debt ceiling has not been discussed within conservative politics, or at least to the extent it was in the pre-Trump era, for 5 or 6 years. It has not been discussed at all. Nobody really cares about it as they did in 2014 and 2013, where there was shutdown fights over the debt and government spending. Nobody seems to care about that anymore, and I would probably say they're right to not care about it, but they're still insistent on this. And they also, and part of that deal is that if they have to, for government funding, is that they will look to make cuts to entitlement programs such as Social Security and other things that are quite popular with the general public. And a big reason that Trump was the nominee in 2016 is he's like, no, we're not going to do cuts to these entitlement programs. We're going to protect them because people really like them. And people much preferred that than Paul Ryan wanting to downsize and privatize Social Security and eliminate it, which they're always obsessed with doing. They're like, we're gonna cut entitlements, which that is essentially saying we're gonna lose elections just for budget autism and because AEI and heritage scholars tell us we need to do this. That is what they do. And also some of their donors, of course, many of their donors want this as well. But that concern came into this. So that's actually very unpopular and they always want to say that these conservatives were representing the will of the people. The people were finally speaking out. They do represent a demographic. I will say that. And that demographic is hardcore conservative media consumers. And a lot of their grievances were very legitimate that should be heard out. But people need to realize that this is not representing a silent majority. The silent majority was more concerned with Damar Hamlin, the Bills player who had some type of cardiac arrest on the playing field. Causes of that are still to be determined. But most people were focused on that. They were focused on sports betting. They were focused on many other issues. The speaker battle was not. It was something that political news junkies were focused on. That was the main concern. And longer term, I don't think people are going to remember this fight. I've seen all these tweets are saying that like anyone who voted for McCarthy who betrayed us, you're going to get primaried. I can guarantee you that none of the people who any primary campaign where that's the chief issue is probably not going to go anywhere because people are already going to forget that issue. And maybe it turns out McCarthy was, did what conservatives want, so maybe it won't have as much heft as it did last week as people want to see it. But nonetheless, a lot of these concerns are still Tea Party-esque rather than MAGA-esque. Some of it's like good stuff. I mean, fighting over the border, the church-style committee. I don't even think the Tea Party would have been into that back in the day, but now they are, and that is a very MAGA Trumpist way of looking at this. But it's very funny that a lot of these types who were the biggest supporters of this, and some of these people are new right types who were like, they got to do this, they got to read Carl Schmitt, and their preferred republicanism adopts some quasi-socialism, like more spending, more government control over things, and then all the congressmen that they're supporting are wanting less government control over the economy. They want less government spending. They want to cut these government entitlements that all the new right types want to expand and to add to. And so it is funny that you have this discrepancy between some of the people who are supporting these guys versus the actual congressmen and what their concerns were, which pretty much all of them would fit in with the old Tea Party and the issues that they fought over. So the fight is a rebuke to those who think that we're on our way to a multiracial, working class, populist Republican Party led by that's standing up for the workers, and really what Republican, the big fight that happens, which the new right is on the side of the insurgents, and the insurgents are wanting cuts to entitlement programs, less government spending, and less government, while all these people want big government, expanded entitlements, more government spending. And so that is a funny discrepancy you see between the rhetoric you have on Twitter and the rhetoric that goes on in Congress. But even besides the new right concerns, or whatever, post-liberal, or whatever you want to call these people who get into this stuff, it did not have very Trumpian concerns either, or the type of issues that Trump ran on in 2016 and 2020 at the fore. And immigration is a huge issue right now, and that was a very much of a secondary issue. Yes, they have a border wall thing coming up, but it was really mostly over these insider baseball issues and government spending, rather than something to deal with immigration, that they want to fight over immigration and the border crisis that's going on, which would have been a more Trumpian fight on that. The church style committee is something, as I already mentioned, yeah, that's a little bit more MAGA than Tea Party, or at least from the standards now. But elsewhere, it's the same. And I think a big part of the battle that you can see, if Kevin McCarthy had lost, people would have been declaring that as a victory. And depending on who the House Speaker was, it could have been. If I did have a tweet saying, if Jim Jordan was the guy, then yeah, that would be a victory. And there were some rumors I was hearing that, McCarthy felt that there was no path to victory, and he was just going to endorse Jim Jordan rather than Steve Scalise for the job, because he felt that Steve Scalise was encouraging the opposition for his own benefit. And he did not see that with Jim Jordan. So as a way of spiting Steve Scalise, he would go with Jim Jordan, which explains a lot of the fights that were going on. It's like, I just really don't like McCarthy, and I'd vote for anyone but McCarthy just to send a message to McCarthy. And that was what was driving a lot of the opposition. And that's what drives a lot of politics. A lot of politics you think is some ideological disagreement or some fight over principles, but really it's just petty personal differences coming to the fore and people not really liking each other. But outside of that issue, I would say that if it was anybody but McCarthy, and Joe Jordan wouldn't be that much of a de-Trumpification, but the most likely candidate would have been Steve Scalise, and that would have been a sign of the party de-Trumpifying. It would have been shown that the conservative insurgents, like the most right-wing guys in Congress, say, we don't care what Trump thinks. We're going back to our Tea Party ways. We're going back to the Tea Party philosophy, and that's what's guiding us in Congress. Some of the stuff we are for are shared with America First and some of the nationalists, but our main focus is still like government spending and the debt ceiling and those typical concerns that define the Tea Party, rather than the concerns that define the Trump moment, which were demographics, identity issues, a lot of this culture war stuff. They'll incorporate some of that in there, but they're still primarily focused on the debt and government spending and getting smaller government, which is a return to the Tea Party. And they would have gotten somebody who is less beholden to Trump and even less beholden to the House Conservatives and Steve Scalise or whoever they had picked. So it would have shown the party, McCarthy losing would have also been seen as a loss for Trump. And everyone would have rushed to make that analysis and make that conclusion in the same way that they did with the 2022 midterms, where they're saying, this is a rebuke of Trump. This is a rejection of Trumpism. This is showing that the American public is moving beyond Trump, and that the real solution for the party is to ditch Trump and to move on to greener pastures with someone else, someone who's more electable. And you would have seen similar arguments with this for the if McCarthy had lost. It would just said that the party no longer cares about Trump. Trump no longer controls the base. It's these these insurgents who control the base, and that their concerns are more along with the lines of Tea Party and that and those issues. Now, some people may say like we need to de-Trumpify so we can become more Trumpist than Trump. But all these things that happen are not about returning to Trumpism without Trump or Trumpism beyond Trump. It's about returning to 2014 politics. That's all it is. It's that, the establishment side needs more power to pick electable candidates, and the only people opposing that are those who feel that the Republican Party needs to fight more fiercely to limit the size of government and limit entitlement programs. Now, we're not entirely there yet, but that's in some of the trajectory that we see in the speaker battle. You can see the party moving in that direction of moving back to the pre-Trump era. And that's what it was like in the pre-Trump era. There was some of these Tea Party guys who were huge amnesty supporters that people were like, this guy is base because he's about fixing the government. He wants to limit the size of government. It's just, Paul Ryan is an example of that. People saw him in 2012, 2013 as this hardcore conservative, this right-wing extremist because of his opinions about the government and what it should do with entitlement programs. And of course, he was a major amnesty booster, wanted more immigration, horrible on race issues and identity issues. But people were like, oh, he is a right-wing extremist, that guy. And there were some of the other Tea Party guys who were in that. Ben Sasse won his Senate seat in 2014 as being a Tea Party guy, and he was always a fan of more immigration. Marco Rubio is another example. Even though the conservatives started to turn on him in 2013 due to his support for amnesty, but not all of them. But he was a guy who seen Tea Party, strong conservative, and his major plan was to legalize millions of illegal aliens. So you always had that where guys were not committed to the identity issues, and some people would still see them as based or hardcore right-wing conservative. Even in the primaries, Newt Gingrich was seen as the more right-wing candidate than Mitt Romney, but on immigration, he was worse than Mitt Romney in 2012. So you had that all the time. But Trump shook up things and made the identity issues be the real litmus test for whether you're a true right-winger or not. And we still live in that era. And there are people who are going to hold those Republicans accountable, such as Tucker Carlson, who is as I always like to point out, the #1 cable news show host. He still has a lot of authority over the party and a lot of sway over it. And he makes sure that those identity issues stay at the forefront, not this government spending and all that. And the speaker battle, yeah, and even though none of those candidates, pretty much all the congressmen involved were guys who are the most likely to speak out about identity issues. Gates, Scott Perry, Gosar, Rosendale, some of these other guys. I mean, Rosendale and Gosar and Perry. I don't know if Rosendale has specifically said that, but I know Perry, Gosar, and some of these other guys have, talked about the Great Replacement. Rosendale led the fight against Juneteenth. So these guys get it. But they also, it's a matter of what they're going to care most about. Is it the Tea Party stuff or is it the identity stuff? And that's a real question you have to have there. And if you don't have a Trumpian-like figure to push them in the direction of the identity stuff, they're going to retreat to the fiscal stuff and pretend and act like that's what makes them right-wingers and anti-establishment revolutionaries and that type of stuff. So you really have to worry about that de-Trumpification factor, because for everyone is going all about DeSantis and DeSantis this, is that DeSantis is not a Trump figure. You can like DeSantis, you can think that he may be a better choice for 2024, but he is not a Trump figure in that he doesn't push the party in a direction. He is responding to the direction he feels the party is going in. He is more of a sponge than a conductor in the way that Trump is. Trump pushed the direction of the party where it is. Trump made the party more nationalistic. Trump made the party care more about these identity issues and talk about them and not be so obsessed with the fiscal stuff. DeSantis is more responding to the moment and what he feels will make him more popular. And another thing, everyone's talking about how this is Trump. This shows that the Trump, no longer matters in the party, and people are criticizing him for backing Kevin McCarthy and stuff. Ron DeSantis wasn't involved in this battle at all. I mean, it's smart for him not to be involved, but it also shows that he's not the leader of the party either. And I think if he ever came to be the leader of the party, it'd be more of going along with the establishment, probably even more so than Trump did, and not trying to get into these battles, and also not being really a light post or I don't know if light post is a tower for the party, for those anti-establishment people to rally around and to direct their energy towards, or feel that they have somebody who's guiding them and pushing them in a right direction. I think he's just somebody who responds rather than pushes. And that's my opinion on DeSantis. And de-Trumpification is a major problem with the party. I think, as I said, you may think that Trump may not be the best candidate for 2024. You may think that it's time for him to retire. But if that's what happens, you don't have a figure to replace him. DeSantis is not that guy. Josh Hawley is not that guy. Ted Cruz is not that guy. Greg Abbott is not that guy. I don't think anyone suggests Greg Abbott. Some people used to suggest Josh Hawley and others as that guy. They are not Trump-like figures. They are just simple politicians who are just there to respond to the crowd, and they're not going to push the party and the conservative base in a direction in the way that Trump could. They are not those dynamic, charismatic leaders you need to lead a real change in the party and the real change in the way the party thinks. As Trump, for all of his faults, Trump changed how the party approached immigration. Nobody talked about limiting legal immigration before Trump. Now it's very common for Republicans to talk about limiting legal immigration. It was also the party was divided on the issue of amnesty. Now the party is universally opposed to amnesty. There are still guys who want some form of amnesty, but they have to hide around. They have to sneak about it. They have to say this isn't an amnesty, that they don't want to legalize all illegal aliens. The idea of legalizing all illegal aliens is just a non-starter in the party now. They can support some form of amnesty, like one for dreamers or one for maybe some specific set of illegal aliens. But even those positions are less popular than a full grand amnesty for all illegal aliens were before Trump in the party. So that is like a positive change. Now, if you get rid of that Trump factor, and also for some reason Tucker no longer became as influential, you could see the party revert to form. The only thing that, you do have de-Trumpification happening in some manner or form. I mean, the fact that they all just decided that they didn't need to listen to Trump and just, wave him off. The only thing that made the party more right-wing in the 2022 primaries was Trump. They all wanted to get rid of these cucks like Liz Cheney, Meyer, all these terrible people who, voted for Trump's impeachment. And the one person endorsed candidates and helped people out in those campaigns was Trump. It wasn't DeSantis, it wasn't Hawley, it wasn't anyone else. And he was the decisive factor in ensuring that people like Liz Cheney did not return to Congress. And the threat of having Trump against them made some guys retire. The only person that he failed in the primary when it came to these these lawmakers, these congressmen, was Nancy Mace, which now all these people want to primary Nancy Mace, and many of those people who are wanting to primary Nancy Mace are wanting to de-Trumpify the party. But if you don't have a figure like Trump backing a primary challenger, he did back a primary challenger against Nancy Mace. He did not directly campaign for that primary challenger, but if he had, Nancy Mace probably would have lost. But let's say you try to primary Nancy Mace again in 2024. If you do not have a Trump figure involved, and if you have Trump mitigated and ostracized from the party and kicked out of the party and we're just moving along, you are not going to have a successful primary challenger. Ron DeSantis is not going to back that primary challenger in the way that Trump would. Ron DeSantis isn't going to back primary challengers at all like Trump did. He is, he may have good policies, may have good positions, but he's not going to push, as I keep saying, he's not going to push the GOP strongly in the direction it needs to go like Trump did. Now, of course, Trump could have done more, but compared to the alternatives, he did more than they would ever do. Another stage in this de-Trumpification effort came in the negative response towards Trump's election analysis of 2022. In a Truth Social post, he blamed the abortion issue for why the election went the wrong way for Republicans, not Trump himself. I will read what he said. He said, "It wasn't my fault that the Republicans didn't live up to expectations in the midterms. I was 233 to 20. It was the abortion issue," which he for some reason put in quote tweets, are quotes, "poorly handled by many Republicans, especially those that firmly insisted on no exceptions, even in the case of rape, incest, or life of the mother, that lost large number of votes. Also, the people that pushed so hard for decades against abortion got their wish from the U.S. Supreme Court and just plain disappeared, not to be seen again." Maybe not the wisest thing for someone running in the Republican presidential primary to say, but there is a lot of truth there, which is why he hopefully re-truthed it on Truth Social. It's a contentious issue when you bring up the abortion thing. It's one, the Republican Party is always going to be pro-life. It is always going to be in favor of abortion restrictions compared to the Democrats, who are going to oppose any restrictions up until birth. They may even someday want support postpartum abortions with how crazy they're going. So Republicans have effectively pushed abortion. But the way that Republicans are in denial that the abortion issue played any role in the 2022 midterms is astounding. I always say the honest position is this, is for Republicans to say, look, we knew we were going to take a setback in the midterms for overturning Roe v. Wade. But we have waited 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade, and we feel that this political accomplishment is worth it, is worth one disappointing midterm. I think if Republicans said that, they're like, yes, we realize that it did not help us in the elections. We realize it hurt us in the elections, but we were fine with that to accomplish a larger political goal. That is honest analysis. I would say that that's a fine position. I've always said that. But that's not what Republicans say. That's not what conservative commentators say. They say that the abortion issue didn't play a role at all. It was all Trump's fault. And in fact, Republicans should have been more pro-life. Our pro-lifers won by big margins, which fails to note how the abortion issue played a major role in Pennsylvania, where Doug Mastriano ran heavily on it. And even though Doug Mastriano was not Dr. Oz, people associated the Republican Party with quote-unquote pro-life extremism or anti-abortion extremism due to Doug Mastriano running heavily on that issue for governor of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is probably not the right state to do that. You can do that in Alabama or, Arkansas or Mississippi. It's not going to hurt you there. But, in battleground states, you got to be a little bit careful about that. So they ran heavily on that issue. Republicans got trounced. And that was unlike in a state in Arizona where the two statewide figures lost, but people down ballot did pretty well. Pennsylvania, the whole down ballot was wiped out. Like, that was a ticket hard hit. And people always want to blame the Trump factor there, but then they'll ignore the abortion factor, even though Doug Mastriano was talking way more about abortion than he was Trump. And so were Democrats in that area as well. Even in some of these Virginia congressional races, there was a race between Abigail Spanberger and some base Latina. I forget the Latina's name because she lost. And the Latina was running on a strong abortion, total abortion ban with no exceptions, which is the apparent issue that every Republican has to take. If you support any exceptions, that is considered the wrong position, and it's not going to help you in a primary. But this woman ran on that. And Spanberger ran several ads against this woman about her calling her an abortion extremist and highlighting how she supports an abortion ban with no exceptions. And that should have been a seat Republicans should have won, and they lost. And in Michigan, they ran heavily. The whole statewide ticket, every Michigan Republican ran heavily on the abortion issue from Tudor Dixon on down. And along with trans athletes in girls sports. These were their major issues that they're running on, and they got clobbered. And you can even say in Arizona, I remember when Arizona, they had their state courts returned a law that was like from the 19th century, which was like a very strict abortion ban. And I said, this may impact the races in Arizona. And it might have done that, but even Arizona's a weirder state of just how it was, because the down ballot Republicans, unlike in Michigan and Pennsylvania, did well, but the the main statewide candidates did poorly or did not win. But in Michigan, Republicans got clobbered all across the board. And even in Virginia, where they probably should have picked up more seats, or at least one more House seat, they lost largely due to the abortion issue, just what Democrats were talking about. And Democrats didn't have, as I always said this before the election, Democrats did not have much to run on. All they had was threat to democracy, abortion, and Ukraine. And if you looked at all the campaign rhetoric, it was about those, maybe not so much Ukraine, but it was mainly about those two issues. And they'd sometimes bring up Ukraine, and they tie Ukraine to threats to democracy and that stuff. But threats to democracy and abortion were very, very influential in what Democrats were pushing out there. So this was not an issue that nobody was campaigning on. And polling shows that people cared about this issue. I mean, for most polls, abortion is never a top 5 issue for voters in most elections. It's often not even a top 10 issue for voters. It's very limited. It's never played much of a factor at the general election level. You could say it maybe gets more volunteers out and that stuff. It doesn't play a factor. I remember in 2020 doing this podcast, and I said that due to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death and the elevation of Amy Coney Barrett, that the abortion issue may play a factor in 2020. It did not. It did not. So I wondered if that was, and it didn't seem to have done that. Exit polls didn't show that. But exit polls this time are very clear, showing that a large percentage of voters cared about abortion. Now, you could say that all those voters were going to vote Democrat as well. That's the case, but it probably helped turn out for Democrats, because a lot of these Zoomers and young, I guess there's still some young millennial women out there, who would have otherwise not voted. They're like, who cares? But then they're like, oh my God, Republicans are going to be in control of my body. I've got to go out there and vote. And I don't think Republicans, they were always going to take a setback from that, but Republicans didn't really help it, due to, as what Trump said, is that the party mandates, and a lot of conservatives mandate, you have to campaign on an abortion ban with no exceptions. And as I've always argued, you have to allow leeway for these Republicans if they hope to win in battleground states on that issue. And you can't make them campaign heavily on this issue when it's likely it's not as popular as pro-lifers say. When abortion referendums were put on the ballot in several states this year, in deep red Kansas, in Montana, and in Kentucky, all solid red states, they all lost. Now, you could argue the way they were worded was weird. Maybe they didn't word correctly. But if you're looking at the evidence, they lost. And in Kansas, they lost by a lot, even though the wording of the bill was weird. There is not this evidence that's showing that it was a huge winner for Republicans. Now, I always want to say, if you're fine with that, if you're saying that it's too important to care about the electoral ramifications and it's worthwhile you'll gain a larger political victory besides elections by going with these ideas than going with these bans, then yeah, that's an honest position. That's your position that you're going to go with. But you have to admit that it's not the winning issue that pro-lifers claim it is. It is not this issue. And pro-lifers have just been spreading copium for a long time. I mean, they used to claim that millennials and Zoomers were the pro-life generation, that they were more pro-life than their elders, and more people were moving to the pro-life direction. Complete opposite is what happened, is that more of America is pro-choice and pro-abortion than ever before. And among young people, it's like unlike their parents who would have said, well, we should keep it legal, but I still think it's morally wrong. Young people don't even see, a growing percentage of young people. I don't know if it's a full majority yet, but it's close to it, think that there's nothing wrong with abortion, that there's no moral wrong with it. So the pro-life movement has, what they said about the pro-life generation is completely wrong. And I think there is something to say for Trump where he said that these people disappeared, is that for a long time, Republicans have been told, we have to do this. You have to please your base. You have to do this in order, overturn Roe v. Wade. And it'll be huge political rewards from your base. And he said these people didn't turn up. And I think this goes to a certain point that indicates that there is not unlike with the pro-choice side, there is not a swing or apathetic voter who will be willing to turn out to vote for pro-life issues in a way that it is for pro-choicers. As I outlined, there is a whole demographic of young people who are not going to vote otherwise, but if they feel that, evil Republicans are going to try to control their bodies and vote and ban birth control, they'll turn out in droves, which is what happened in a lot of these college campuses where they're expecting a lower turnout, and these kids, some of them masked up, turned out to vote against the evil Republicans. There is not that demographic that is otherwise going to stay at home if Republicans don't deliver pro-life victories. That demographic is very politicized, and they also care about a lot of other issues besides pro-life when it comes to the base of conservatives. The grassroots is very pro-life, but they have a lot of other issues that they care about. And there are a lot of people who will say that they're pro-life, particularly Republican voters, that that's their issue, but they're not as motivated they're already voting, rather than with the pro-choice issue, whether you can use that issue to push people to the ballot box who otherwise wouldn't be turning out to vote. And you don't have that on the other side. And even for that grassroots that's already out there voting, being really engaged in politics and the campaigns, it's not one of their major issues. I think immigration, crime, even taxes, those types of things generally factor more into why they're out there. There are very dedicated pro-lifers who are in religious communities, but even for evangelicals seem more worked up by the trans stuff at the moment than what's going on in schools. I mean, critical race theory and the gender theory and all the other crazy stuff in schools motivates a lot more of those people and the grassroots than the abortion issue does. But they are pro-life. I'm not saying that they're pro-choice and that they're going to, that's the real position. I'm just saying in their hierarchy of where they rank it, it's not their top issue, as some pro-lifers like to claim. But where it is a top issue is actually, curiously enough, for what you would call the establishment. For a lot of the DC political operators, and especially for Conservative Inc. and conservative media, it's their top issue, and they get very mad about anything that goes against it. It's one of their top issues. I mean, you could say foreign policy stuff like support for Israel, then abortion. Those are like their major concerns that they get really ticked off that there's somebody who goes against that. And so a lot of these people who are involved in campaigns at the top levels and are, and these candidates who see responses to what they're saying know that they'll be attacked by conservative media and the elements of the establishment if they go against this. And one thing to realize is the establishment, even though they like to claim the pro-life stuff is like, the establishment is anti, is willing to give it up or throw it away. The establishment will never betray the pro-life side or go against the pro-life side like they will on other issues. On crime, they'll support criminal justice reform, even though the base is radically opposed with it. On immigration, they will sometimes consider amnesty. They really wanted amnesty back in the day, and they'll still even entertain ideas of amnesty that the base really hates. And even foreign policy stuff, the base really doesn't like this Ukraine stuff, but they say Ukraine is more important than anything else. We're going to give billions of dollars to them. With pro-life, they will sometimes fail to deliver what they promise, but they will never actively work against the pro-life side like they will on other issues. They're never going to agree to reaffirming Roe v. Wade, which would be the equivalent of how they treat the immigration issue and, supporting amnesty. They're never willing to cave on that. They'll sometimes maybe not, insist on defunding Planned Parenthood in a budget bill, but they still would try to defund Planned Parenthood and still try to restrict abortion on any issue. And it very much is very hard for Republicans to try to get a restriction on the national level, because I mean, Lindsey Graham tried to do a nationwide restriction level. I think it was at 14 weeks, but the whole pro-life side hated it. They're like, this isn't enough. We must go further, which they don't have the votes to go further, and they know that like if they go for further restriction, that's going to hurt them in elections. But they're never going to say, oh well, screw you, we're going to actually go for supporting third trimester abortions. The Republicans will never do that. And as we're seeing now in the wake of Roe v. Wade's overturning, they're delivering a lot of results for the pro-life side, but a lot of these people who are in commentariat, who are very pro-life, as I talked about in my year in review IQ supplement, a lot of these people just want to abandon the Republican Party, and they're like, I wish I could vote for Democrats. Literally, Democrats, all they would have to argue is not even a 14-week ban, like no abortions after 14-week ban. They could just do a 20-week ban, and all these pro-lifers like, we're voting Democrat now. They're the real pro-life party, much unlike these Republicans. And like Republicans, like, we've give you everything you want. We've done so much more for a lot for you guys, more so than other constituencies. And another constituency that they'll even try to betray is the gun rights people, which, they pushed a gun control bill, like it was a truncated gun control bill, but they still did that this last summer. They would never try to do that type of Democrat compromise bill on abortion. Nor would Democrats ever do that. But these people will still look for any opportunity to vote Democrat, even though Democrats, the consensus opinion is we'll support abortion up until birth. And they're never going to do that. But if they ever try to do, well, we're actually going to make it a 20-week ban, and it just need to be one or two Democrats to do that. Like, oh, we're going for the Democrats now. They're the pro-life party. And it's like, we're doing like total bans in states, and even like heartbeat bills are getting passed everywhere, and you're still not satisfied with what we're doing. And so I think for the people that's like their main issue, they're not particularly loyal. I'm actually going to repeat some points. They abandoned Steve King, even though he was the most pro-life congressman. They didn't defend him just for making some offensive comments. They threw him to the wolves. They immediately denounced the Covington Catholic kids when they got caught smirking against an Indian at a March for Life. Immediately disavowed. They don't stand up for a lot of these people. They're not standing up for Trump, even though Trump was the most pro-life president since Roe v. Wade was passed. Like, he has done far more than any other president to push America in a more pro-life direction. Don't defend him. Don't care for him. They hate him. I mean, some of it can be his comments about the abortion issue, and they all dunked on him for this. I mean, it's their issue. It's not surprising they would do this. But even before then, they were all, didn't care for him and didn't support him. They're not a particularly loyal segment where that's their main issue. So it's Trump's comments were, not what people want to hear, but they were true. I think in the proper response for pro-lifers is to say, well, okay, but it was worth it to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I think that's a legitimate thing. But to then pretend that it was a winning issue, and actually the Republicans should have been more pro-life, as that was the real problem, which Michigan shows that's not the case, and it was all Trump's fault. When all these Democrats were running on abortion, they were highlighting abortion much more so than they were with Trump. And it's the same with the general election Republicans. Everyone was talking about abortion way more than Trump, and yet it was apparently a non-factor, and it was all Trump's fault that Republicans lost these midterms, not abortion as an issue. The thing they need to answer for, and there's people, I was seeing this long thread about Ben Domenech, who was acting like a jilted ex-girlfriend towards Trump, who pretended to be pro-Trump when Trump was president, then immediately disavowed him. And before Trump was president, he was demanding the Republicans and conservatives oppose Trump's white nationalism, is now going anti-Trump. And he said Trump's comments were totally wrong. The abortion was not a non-factor. And also these exceptions is that every Republican supports exceptions in the life of the mother, which is one of the things that Trump probably should have taken out, is that pretty much everyone agrees with the exceptions of life of mother, but really it's the rape and incest exceptions that they oppose. And so he was trying to do these pedantic points about saying like Trump's totally wrong, this is idiotic. But the one thing they need to contend with is that this exit poll, after saying assessing the 5 most important issues in the election, and 27% of voters said abortion was their most important issue, and 76% of those who said it was their most important issue voted Democrat versus 23%. Was the issue that most favored Democrats out of all issues, and it was the second highest issue ranked in terms of importance. Inflation was number 1. That helped Republicans at 31%, abortion 27%. Crime and gun policy were equal at 11%. Gun policy helped Democrats slightly, with 60% favoring Democrats. Crime was 57% favoring Republicans, not as much as you would think. Immigration overwhelmingly favored Republicans at 73% for Republicans versus 25% for Democrats. But, the most overwhelmingly lopsided issue and second most important, according to voters, was abortion, and it overwhelmingly favored Democrats. So they have to contend with this. As I said, the honest position is say, that's fine. We're willing to have disappointing results on one election to accomplish a major long-term victory. But that's not the issue. And what's going to happen is Republicans are going to pretend this is all Trump's fault, not reassess the abortion issue at all, and still create a litmus test where every Republican has to support abortion with no exception, or abortion ban with no exceptions. And they'll just say, in the case of the life of the mother, which everyone always supports, that's never been an issue at hand. And they have to stand with that issue, even though that stance is still going to lose in red states when they do these referendums. They're just never going to admit it because they don't want to, and people want to hear what they want to hear. And it's far more convenient to blame Trump and to support the effort of de-Trumpification than reassessing how they campaign on issues and saying that they may share blame. It's much easier to say this is all Trump's fault and then imagine that Ron DeSantis will be much better than Trump in all respects. But a lot of this stuff is just reverting us back to 2014. This is the only issue. The speaker battle that I'm talking about is the only issue we're going to discuss in normal time. We have 2 kind of lead questions I'll get to. But the final point I wanted to make is that there was something very disappointing in the speaker battle. And no, it wasn't over some of the things or who they were trying to pick. I would say a pretty cringe moment was who they wanted to pick as their alternative to McCarthy. And now I want to say that they just did this person as a placeholder. I don't think that this is who they wanted, but the meta-political moment and the significance of it says a lot. All the Republicans picked Byron Donalds, or the 20 holdouts at one point rallied behind Byron Donalds as their guy. Byron Donalds he's no longer a freshman congressman. I think he was elected in 2020. Black conservative from Florida. He's otherwise decent on the issues. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that of who he is, and it's he's a black Republican, whatever. As long as if he's fine on the issues, that's all right. He can be better than some, but people were seriously taking him as their House Speaker, and Chip Roy got up and he was saying, I want to remark on the historical significance of this, that we have 2 black Americans for the first time ever nominated for House Speaker, because Hakeem Jeffries was the Democratic choice. Hakeem Jeffries is a really bad public speaker, as said by his, the speech he gave after, before giving the speaker gavel to McCarthy. He's like, we are diverse, we black, red, secular, and Christian, and faithful in this. And it was like a store brand Obama, but with more trouble enunciating words. Anyway, enough on that. That's a digression. So Chip Roy announces for Byron Donalds, and the whole House got up and gave standing applause to the idea that they finally now have 2 black guys running for Speaker. And then he said, and then he quoted Martin Luther King without saying, I want a country where you could judge by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin. And then and Democrats rightfully booed that. It was really cringe. But even that was wrong. It's the sole reason they were picking Byron Donalds was just because of the color of his skin. And they were just using this as we'll show the Democrats who the real racists are. We'll show the establishment as the real racist. And there was even some people making those arguments about the establishment, like, why would they not vote for a black guy? Well, it's maybe because he doesn't have much experience in Congress, and it's really just the affirmative action choice. As I remarked in a tweet saying that Republicans really showed off their opposition to affirmative action by picking with their choice for with their alternative to McCarthy. Now it's just the placeholder. Shouldn't be assessed too deeply, but it does show how much the black worship, magic worship, is embedded within the Republican Party. And even when Matt Gaetz got up to nominate Trump, a main reason he said that Trump should be the House Speaker is all the great things he did for blacks. It's like, this is what our whole country is obsessed with, is like how much and what makes you a good politician is how much you benefit black Americans. And it's a little disappointing. It's a little dispiriting to see this type of rhetoric come from Republicans than that. Byron Donalds was not a very serious candidate. I think if he was more serious and that they were actually trying to rally behind him and actually trying to whip votes, and maybe him suggested the compromise candidate, or even possibly being House Speaker, I think that would have been a major black pill moment on meta, politically speaking, just that Republicans decided to pick some random black guy just because he's black to be their House Speaker, which is showing how even this affirmative action mindset reigns over Republicans. But they didn't do it. But just those little things you see matter, and it does show how much work we have to do to push the party and politics in the right direction, that we're just not going to pick a random black guy to be House Speaker just to own the libs and show that they're the real racists, and that we're going to actually genuinely pick people based on merit, not on the color of their skin, which Byron Donalds, despite all the the good things he's done, he's like a decent congressman, is that he was picked just because of the color of his skin, which is violating the words that Chip Roy was stating. And it was just done for effect, and that this is the culture of America, and that order to make yourself seem the good guys or the virtuous side is you have to embrace black worship and embrace the side of civil rights. And even the historical references they're going to use and the quotes and rhetoric they use, it's harking back to Martin Luther King and implying that Martin Luther King is the true founder of this country, which he's not. So that was just a disappointing moment, or rather a very cringe moment within the House Speaker battle. But it didn't carry on for too long. They eventually, indicating Donalds was just there as a placeholder, they eventually began voting for Andy Biggs or Jim Jordan again rather than Byron Donalds. So it's just a little disappointing, but not something probably not to get too worked up on. It was just something I wanted to bring up. And that's my concluding thoughts on that topic. I think it'll be very interesting how Congress works. Actually, I have one more thought that I need to get for as a good concluding thought. I think a major reason why people got into the speaker battle, probably more than you would have thought, or people really made this as like a critical battle for civilization, or in some of the rhetoric people were using as like this is showing that the people rising up and holding people accountable, is that Republicans had such a disappointing midterms, and a lot of the conservatives feel dispirited. They feel despondent. I'm using a lot of words that mean the same thing, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. It's that they needed a fight to show that they're still there, and they need to get something worked up about, because people, even looking at this Congress coming up, it's likely not going to do anything. Biden's still president. They still have the Senate majority, bare Senate majority. Republicans have a bare House majority, a very thin House majority. There's not going to be anything major accomplished. And so people just realize that this is the one time that they can make their voices heard and have a big battle over what's going on. And so people really focused on that and really wanted to make more of a stink about it, or more focus on it, than it probably otherwise, I don't want to say it otherwise deserved, because the House Speaker battle is important in how American politics is followed in this, but it probably was not, it was nowhere near as important as the midterms. And it's probably not, it's not as important as the upcoming primary battle, but I think a lot of people realize that some of these stuff is going to be very demoralizing, both the midterms and possibly the upcoming primary battle and how it's going to operate. And they wanted something to like let out that anger, and they were tired of the establishment not getting any blame for the disappointing midterm results. And a lot of people deserve to lose their seats, like Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell was one of the big losers of the election. Unfortunately, the guy who challenged him was another loser of the election, Rick Scott, who ran the Republican Senate Committee, which was also backed losers in the campaign. McCarthy was actually one of the few genuine winners, even though I think he could have done his campaign a lot better. I mean, he did try to support Meyer and some of these other terrible candidates who lost their seats against good primary challengers. And I think that's why they made this demand that he no longer fund candidates in open primary seats so they can allow more right-wing challengers to help them win. So that's a big change. But I think they also see that Ronna McDaniel is probably going to win her chairmanship or chairwomanship, you would say, the chair again of the RNC. And some people are really frustrated that like all these leaders of the party have not taken any consequences. And the one opportunity they had was with McCarthy. And Trump made a very good point saying that like Mitch McConnell is much more deserving of the scorn and anger than McCarthy, even though McCarthy is not great. He at least, I would say this, like Tucker used to attack McCarthy for not having any principles. In some ways, it's better that he doesn't have any principles because he's more willing to bend to pressure from conservatives, from Tucker, and from Trump than someone like McConnell. McConnell has principles and an ideology, and it sucks. It's just standard business first Republicanism that, and that's why he will openly announce that Ukraine is the most important issue facing our country today. McCarthy is smart enough not to say that issue because he feels pressure and he cares about pressure from Tucker, from conservatives, from House Freedom Caucus, from Trump. And they know that that's not going to be the type of situation. So he is much more beholden to that type of pressure to get him to move in a right direction because he doesn't have any principles. It's just about power. And that makes him more useful than someone with an ideology because otherwise you're like, well, we want someone with principles and ideology. That could mean you end up with someone like John McCain or Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan had a lot of principles and ideology and was horrible. It was the exact shit that we're trying to expunge from the Republican Party. So it's much better that he has no principles than he does have principles. And that's always, I think, a selling point for him. And he was willing to, accommodate both Trump and these conservatives, which is an indication that he's more likely to be better than someone like Steve Scalise, who is not as willing to be accommodating to them. Obviously, and there's the alternatives. I mean, Jim Jordan didn't want it, so there wasn't really a good alternative to McCarthy that was ever pushed forward. And I always say that like his lack of principles is actually a good selling point rather than a negative point. But Trump made a good point by saying that McConnell is more deserving of the scorn. But they don't have the ability to get rid of McConnell because for party leaders in the Senate, all you need is the majority of your caucus voting for you. He got the majority of his caucus voting for him, so he became the minority leader. Not the case in Speaker of the House, where they actually had the ability to hold off on McCarthy winning, on to deny McCarthy the speakership for a time being. And they run concessions out of him. So I think it was successful, but I think people are just so worked up as they're very demoralized from the election. I think a lot of people are angry about how the election turned out, and I think there's a lot of anger against the establishment, and this is the one opportunity that they had to send a message to the establishment. And even though I was skeptical at first that they could have done this because, I always felt like compared to the alternatives, McCarthy probably was better. He was better than Scalise, and he was definitely better than Stefanik. So that's what they went with. But at the end of the day, I think it turned out right. And hopefully this momentum carries forward and these conservatives are able to push for positive advancement in the Republican Party of nationalist ideas, and they do not revert back to the Tea Party form. And this is not a part of a process of deep Trumpification that reverts the party back to 2014. I still think there are factors that are preventing that, namely Tucker Carlson being the most popular cable news show host, Trump still being around, and the fact that you cannot get away with being, hard on fiscal issues, but then an open borders enthusiast. That's no longer going to pass the muster. And also these Republicans who all opposed McCarthy are very solid on the identity issues for the most part. So those are my concluding thoughts on the House Speaker battle. It was an interesting event. As I said, I think people will probably forget about it after a week or so. There are these House rule votes that could make it, this last longer in the public consciousness than more than a week. But I think a month later, most people will forget about it. But maybe we may have another House Speaker vote if he gets a vote of no confidence, which is now very much more likely to happen. The concluding thought, I keep having thoughts that I keep remembering, is the one concluding thought I want to make is the one thing to worry about is that the new rules make the House a lot more anarchic. And there is a possibility with a weakened House Speaker and like anybody and all these people having the ability to propose bills and push them through without the present powers to be in the House having a full say on it, that it could give the opportunity to Democrats and moderate Republicans to band together to pass terrible legislation. I think that there are things in place to prevent that with some of the rules, but a lot of this is insider baseball. But I am worried that some of the conditions that could arise out of this, it could lead to that factor, and that could potentially lead to some form of amnesty passing, which is the main legislation that has to be prevented from happening. I think everything else is pretty safe from happening. But amnesty, I do think that's the one thing that some of these moderate Republicans, who, especially from New York and California, just won new seats, would be willing to vote with Democrats on. And maybe the new rules can allow that type of alliance to work out more effectively than before. So that's just something to worry about, but I'm not confident in that assertion, is that there could be rules in place that would prevent something like that happen. But we'll have to wait to see. So we'll keep an eye on this for the next year or so. It'll actually be for 2 years. So this will definitely be an issue that won't go away anytime soon. Now on to the Cognitive Elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highly-respected.substack.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements if you haven't already while you're there. So the first question comes from Dave, and Dave asks, Scott, what do you think about the Brazilian coup? Even though I think calling it a coup may be a bit of a misnomer, it's something to note. What happened is they stormed their National Assembly, even though it was empty. It was on a Sunday. I think nobody was there. They stormed their parliamentary building, and Bolsonaro supporters did. In some ways, very similar to January 6th. There's nobody there. There's no way to effect a coup. They just kind of stormed it, and I guess we'll figure out a plan later. And unlike January 6th, these people got arrested while doing this. Very few people got arrested on January 6th. I don't think there had to be some arrests on January 6th, but there weren't mass arrests. There were mass arrests there. There's over 500 people have been arrested. The military is not on their side. The people were talking about how the military's come to rescue them. They're protecting the camps. And there were clips and videos of the military arresting these people, even though they were cheering them on. Very kind of a black pill moment. Bolsonaro's not even in Brazil at the moment. He's in America enjoying, I think he was eating at KFC this weekend. He's in Florida, so he's not there in Brazil. I think he's just fleeing to America and claiming asylum so he doesn't get arrested in Brazil. Smart move. The coup, I think there's a lot of popular anger and over the election results, but there's two factors that is preventing a coup. One, doesn't have any institutions on this side. The military doesn't want to support it. The courts don't really want to support it. The police aren't there to support it. That's very different from Latin American coups in the 80s or in the Cold War era, is that you would have the military and then you'd have America backing a coup. So you had those two elements to help, and sometimes churches or religious leaders to also be there for you. So you could have the ability to have a coup, and America would be, sure, we support this. Go ahead and arrest and possibly execute your enemies, as they saw in Chile. There was a military coup in Brazil, I think in might have been the 60s or 70s. They overthrow the military junta in the 80s, mid 80s. So they got rid of the junta, as I want to say. I want to make sure I pronounce it correctly. Junta. not junta or whatever it is, like junta, that was there in control. And so they were able to do this. And America usually backed these forces. America was not backing Bolsonaro. America was backing Lula in this case, even though Lula is more anti-American, more pro-Russia, more pro-China. They view Bolsonaro as a Brazilian Trump, and thus they would rather have a anti-American socialist. I don't know if you would go as far to say an anti-American socialist, but as a guy who is... Bolsonaro also had a decent relationship with Russia and some of these other people we see as geopolitical foes, but Lula has even a more positive relationship with these people. But just due to the fact how America conducts foreign policy now through the prism of domestic politics, and they see this is the Trump guy, we're not going to support him, we're going to support the democracy guy and Lula, and he's for diversity and all these great things, and they'll overlook the fact that he's more pro our geopolitical enemies than Bolsonaro is. He's not all the way in the manner that Maduro is, but it's not enough to have a coup over. And America was very clear that they preferred Lula, and they were absolutely not going to support a coup from Bolsonaro. There was no international actor that would have supported a Bolsonaro coup against Lula. Maybe Israel, but that's it. That's it. I don't even know if Israelis want to get involved in that. That's it. Russia was more pro-Lula. China's more pro-Lula. America's more pro-Lula. Most of the rest of South America is more pro-Lula. I mean, Maduro and some of the other neighbors, Colombia now has a left-wing government, so they're going to be more pro-Maduro. They're going to be more pro-Lula as well. I think Chile also. So most of Latin America is more pro-Lula than I keep wanting to say Maduro, than Bolsonaro. So he had no support. And all he had was these millions of supporters there. But if Brazil is not America. It's not a great power. It's more of a power than some of these African countries and some of the Middle East where they had the Arab Spring, but it's not quite there. And let's say that Bolsonaro did a coup, which he didn't even know if he had the full support of the military to do, which they could put down with violence if they wanted to. It's not quite America. They would definitely shoot these people. And even in America, they would do that. Let's say he effected a coup. They would place international sanctions on him, and the military would also, generals would probably be, some of these generals and others who backed a Bolsonaro coup would also be threatened with personal sanctions, and they'd be realize oh, we made a mistake. Then they'd coup Bolsonaro and return Lula or somebody else to power, as they're wont to do in the face of international pariah status. Brazil is not prepared for international pariah status in the way that Venezuela and some other countries are. And unlike those countries, unlike Venezuela, they were not going to have the support of Russia or China. Those states were going to oppose the coup as well. So he'd have no support on the international stage. He had limited support among institutions in this country. All he had were his own supporters, which that is not enough to effect a coup. And that's the long and short of it. Very different situation from the Cold War, where we would back these right-wing coups against left-wing governments. We now support left-wing governments coming to the fore. As long as they don't go too anti-America, we're fine with them. And I guess they prefer Lula because they saw this through the prism of Trumpism and domestically, and they don't want a Trump to be in power anywhere. And so poor Bolsonaro. I think Bolsonaro is now going to stay in America. I don't think because another bad thing for Bolsonaro is that he doesn't have any international support, is that pretty much every country would extradite him back to Brazil. There is no country that would grant him safe asylum. I mean, Russia's not going to grant him safe asylum. China's not going to grant him safe asylum. I was talking about it with a friend. It's only country besides America may be Israel, but Israel probably wouldn't stand up for him because he's not Jewish. So they'd probably send him back too. And America is probably his only hope because he does have some influence within the Republican Party. There is a chance that the new House GOP may oppose sending Bolsonaro back to a socialist government. And there could be arguments to be made. And it's only hope for not being extradited back to his country for whatever criminal charges they may trump up against him is in America. So he's going to have to be in America and seek asylum here. But that probably means his political career in Brazil is over. So we'll have to see. That's just my viewpoint on it. The coup is not going to be successful because they have no international support, and for a Latin American country, they have to have some international actor being behind them. And it seems that all the institutions, military and police, are on the side of the new government. And the time to have had a coup probably would have been before Lula was put into office last week. So that's it. That's the deal of it. I don't know. Some people are probably going to call that one of the black pills. I have people like saying these are black pills. I mean, no, these are just like fact pills that are happening. I don't think like however Brazil is governed is not that important to us. It's interesting to see, type of populist nationalists get power in these countries, but that's about it. I don't think it's that important. I feel that Orban is more important than Bolsonaro. I think what Italy is doing is more important than Bolsonaro. And so I think like having those type of people getting power in European countries is more important than them getting in power in Latin American countries. And nationalists are doing well, are getting more popular in Europe, and that's something to be white-pilled about moving forward. And mainly our struggle has to be focused on America, not in these international places. Certainly not in Latin America. It's bad for Brazilians. I like Bolsonaro. It'd be great if he was still in power, but it's just not going to happen. The coup is just not going to is just not feasible to do in these circumstances. And Bolsonaro is a reasonable guy, and that's why he, in order to avoid arrest, decided to go to America while the new government was enacted, because he probably realized that something like this was going to happen, and he needs to give himself a chance from not being arrested and facing some whatever charges the new Lula government would put against him. So that's the first Cognitive League question. The next one's a culture question. This comes from Tom. Tom asks, Scott, why do you think Pink Floyd's lyrics are cringe? I think they're very insightful and meaningful. And so there's a lot of Pink Floyd fans out there who really like their lyrics. I like Pink Floyd. I find their music. I like some of their music. Particularly the albums I like are Wish You Were Here and Animals. I'm not that big on Dark Side of the Moon. I don't like The Wall. Some of their earlier psychedelic stuff doesn't really do anything for me. But I do like Wish You Were Here and Animals. But both those albums have some cringe lyrics. And it's not like so bad like, oh man, that line is just so like cheesy. Like, why would they say that? It's more the lyrical subject of the band. And a song I would really highlight is Welcome to the Machine. And people think this like, oh, this is a deep, meaningful characterization of like society. It's like they're pushing you into the machine. This is a social machine. We got to break free of it by getting high and listening to Pink Floyd. That's another problem actually with Pink Floyd. Like, I enjoy their music, but a lot of the music is associated with like, whoa, we're high and we're zoning out, we're spacing out. Pink Floyd, man. And, that's part of the Greer Head pledge is I will not smoke weed. So, in some ways, I think they made their music to be imbibed in those substances. And we're just not going to indulge in those substances. But otherwise, their music is pretty good. Or at least on Animals and Wish You Were Here, which are much more instrumentally focused. There's a lot of breaking free from the traditional rock song format in those. Lots of great guitar work and keyboard work on Animals. Animals is probably my favorite Pink Floyd album. But going back to Welcome to the Machine, people think this is like a social commentary. Is like, no, it's just about the recording contract. It's about how bad like the recording industry is. Like, welcome to the machine. They're killing my artistic creativity. I can't believe, and they're not giving me the proper royalties, and they really ruin you. And you have to think it's like, this is like whining because like, yeah, maybe the royalties weren't there and maybe they're like, hey, can you do a pop song? But it's like also the recording industry in the 70s where all these bands were making complaints about it. It's like they allowed bands to just like, hey, here's a ton of money. You get like a long time to record an album and you can do like 15-minute songs on this album. That's fine. We'll still put it out. Here, complete freedom. They had way more freedom than they did in the 80s and 90s where it's like a band would be like, hey, we want to do a 15-minute song and all songs are going to be long. They're like, hell no, you're not. You're doing some songs we can get radio play for. We're not going to allow you to do this type of shit. And So these guys were given a lot more freedom than artists previously were given, and definitely succeeding them were given. And these guys are just complaining about it, and they're like, "Oh, we're not giving too much royalties." Like anytime like bands complain about like the recording industry and stuff, because a lot of these bands love to make these complaints about it, how they ruined them and stuff. It's like if somebody who's like published a book and had like my like own issues with that, it's like I've become less sympathetic to these guys. It's like, look, like it's a business, you're in there, you're going to there's not going to be the right contract. You're doing this probably because you're negotiating with like a trained contract lawyer. Meanwhile, you're like high in LSD when you're signing the contract. Thus there's going to be a power difference in how that contract is settled. So but I understand, but it's like as a normal listener, it's like I don't share your concern with your recording contract. And it's something like a Hollywood actor doing an entire an essay on how awful their contract to do a movie was. And it's like, well, maybe that's bad for you, but for the normal person, they can't really relate to that because they're still allowing you to pursue your dream and giving you a lot more artistic freedom than others would have. And you're still getting this stuff. So it's not really prevalent to me. And you're making this dark, menacing song about your recording contract. It's a little cringe. And they also have a second song, Have a Cigar, which is like a good song, but it's also on the same topic. And then the other songs, I mean, Dark Side of the Moon is like still obsessed with their former band member, Syd Barrett, who had mental health issues and was also autistic, had some drug problems. And they were obsessed with this guy like that they kicked out of the band. They're like, oh man, we wish you were here. You kicked him out of the band because he's like autistic. And then they had like several other songs about them because all the songs that are not about the recording contract are about Syd Barrett. Wish You Were Here is about Syd Barrett. Shine On You Crazy Diamonds about Syd Barrett. And that's it. Animals has a little bit better commentary, even though they try to be like, we're going to be socially aware commentary. And they have a protest song that against like political figures who were conservative political figures in Britain at the time. The Pigs, that song, which everyone probably knows from haha charade, or charade as they should say, but charade is how it's pronounced in the song. Haha charade you are. Great singing from Highly Respected on this moment. But the figures it's attacking are Mary Whitehouse, who's this morality campaigner, tried to ban a lot of music and primarily movies. Is that there was this thing? This is too much I'm to go into, but I always want to say she wanted to censor a lot of movies and media that were going into. I'm not going to go into the whole Mary Whitehouse background. And it's also the second verse is also attacking, but not by name, Margaret Thatcher before she became prime minister. She's the opposition leader. So it's essentially the song is like a standard Labour Party propaganda going with it. It's like anytime rock bands are like, we're going to be socially aware. We're going to have some strong politics. And it always sounds like even though at the time when I hear new music that's like attacking Trump or something that's recent, it's like comes across very cringe. But I grew up listening to music that was like from the 80s that was like socially aware at the time and talking about political issues, which is like things I didn't experience. So it sounded like less cringe at that time because it's something that you didn't experience and it's less relevant to you. But now, like looking back on it, anytime I hear like a political rock song, I just think of like these aging rockers now doing like an anti-Trump song and thinking about how cringe that is in our time. I now apply that to artists in the past who are doing those type of music, like Metallica on And Justice for All, which it wasn't directly political and stuff, even though they do have a song about global warming in Blacken, which every thrash metal band for some reason wanted to do a song about global warming. And it's not so direct, it becomes like into the side of propaganda. But when they were like looking for inspiration, it wasn't like they really studied these issues. They're like, yeah, we just watched a lot of CNN and got inspiration from that. And so you see the same thing now with these bands who do really cringe political songs. And it's all based on what they watched on MSNBC. So you should avoid that. So anyway, I don't think if you really read into Pink Floyd's lyrics and realize that most of their lyrics are just Roger Waters, and this is not even talking about The Wall, which The Wall is a story in and of itself. It's like it's a rock opera about a rocker who like imagines himself a fascist dictator. In some ways, it's better. It's more interesting lyrics than on the lyrics on all of their albums. But I always find it funny when like people are like, "Oh, these rock lyrics are so meaningful," and usually they're not. So that's why I always liked metal lyrics, because no one takes them or like these are so in depth, like this 300th song about Satan. No one's ever going to say that. It's like they just focus on like horror, violence, fantasy, and the occult. And no one takes it that seriously. And I think it makes it, and sometimes you can't even understand the vocals and the lyrics. So that makes it far superior than to rock bands who try to have meaningful lyrics about the politics of their time, which are their crazy ex-band member, which is what Pink Floyd did. So Pink Floyd's music good, lyrics, and even the singing is fine, but sometimes the lyrics I'm just like, come on, man. A dark, menacing song about your recording contract, I'm not down with it. But that's my thoughts on that. Some people really don't like my music takes, but I'm going to share my music takes anyway. So that's it for this episode today. We're going to have another powerful, impactful IQ supplement later this week, so tune in for that, and another great, highly respected episode. Later this week, we also should be having an article up on Substack this week. I can't give it away. I want to keep it a secret, but it should be up tomorrow or Wednesday, depending on when I get around to finishing it. I'm trying to get one Substack article a week, just to give me something to do. And sometimes they'll be based on things I discussed in the highly respected episode. I just want to put in written form and clear-cut form for people who want to know what I'm saying and thinking. Others, it'll just be topics that I didn't really cover elsewhere, and it's not enough material to do in an IQ supplement or a highly respected segment, so I just do it in an article. So I'm going to start doing that for the new year. Hopefully I stick to it, so we'll be on the lookout for that. So until the next time, stay respected.